This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The views expressed in this work are those of the characters and do not represent any specific political stance. Sterile Fruit. Chapter 1. Sterile Fruit. Tokyo, early November 2028. A cold rain soaked the heavy granite of the National Diet Building. Kasumigaseki, once known as the Sleepless Castle, was now shrouded in an eerie silence due to chronic power shortages and scheduled blackouts. Hitomi Maruki, a high-ranking official at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, sat alone in her dimly lit office, staring blankly at a tablet. In the corner of the screen, YouTube's recommendation algorithm churned out a relentless stream of videos. The world is appalled. Why Japan's railway tech is still the best. China in tears. Why countries that abandoned Shinkansen regret it. Stunned by Japanese civility. 10 reasons foreigners love Japan. As if drawn by a vacuum, Hitomi clicked on one. Bright BGM filled the room as a synthesized voice read out fabricated foreign reactions. Once, she had felt a fleeting sense of pride or catharsis from these. Now, they felt hollow, leaving only a bitter aftertaste. Is this all we have left to cling to? She whispered derisively. The Japan is great. Videos were nothing more than a psychological sedative to ignore the reality of a nation in decline. Her country's technology had been cannibalized, its infrastructure was decaying, and even its defensive shields were being siphoned away. The citizens of this declining developing nation, unable to face the ruin, drowned themselves in illusions crafted from the dregs of past glory. Hitomi herself was no exception until now. A photograph buried deep in the ministry's archives flickered in her mind. It was Beijing in the early 1980s. A sea of people in drab mouse suits, filling the vast avenues with black bicycles. That was the beginning. She remembered the proud smiles of Japanese engineers in those photos, standing before modern plants built with Japanese ODA, official development assistance. We gave those people on bicycles our latest fishing rods. We copied every secret of our bait for them. We never dreamed they would take our fishing grounds, or that we would end up depending on them for the maintenance of our own infrastructure, all locked behind Chinese proprietary standards. Our assistance was their cheat sheet. The only fools were us, blinded by our own vanity. Japan's generosity had invited its own hollowing out. China had swallowed Japanese tech, stripped it down, and then rebranded it with a cunning strategy. Infrastructure that looked cheap and shoddy but was actually designed to bind the client through proprietary locks. Reports from Africa and Southeast Asia lay on her desk, detailing the grim reality. While China-led infrastructure is cheap and rapid, the technical standards are a complete black box. In the event of a failure, local engineers cannot perform repairs. They are forced to order proprietary parts from Chinese firms and maintain high-priced service contracts. A proprietary lock-in strategy. Once it breaks, you're forced to buy their specific replacements forever. Then came the core of the report. As maintenance costs skyrocket, client nations fall into default. Using the debt as leverage, China demands 99-year leases on strategic ports and railways. It is a de facto cession of territory and economic vassalage. Hitomi switched the tablet screen to a live camera feed of a port city in a developing nation. Where once there was nothing but wasteland, a massive, smart logistics hub, built with Chinese capital and tech now sprawled across the coast. There were no U.S. warships there, only gargantuan Chinese container vessels. Automated trucks using Chinese standards moved supplies 24/7 to meet the nation's needs. They lost the port to debt, but it was land that had nothing to begin with. Now the hub serves the locals and improves their lives. Railways and ports, they actually deliver the goods the people need. The cold words of a certain retired YouTuber she had watched online echoed in her mind. It was perhaps similar to how Japan once left behind dams and railways in Manchuria or North Korea, infrastructure that continued to live on long after the regime fell. These Chinese-leased ports had become the living arteries of the people, circulating the lifeblood of goods. Suddenly, an emergency alert chimed on Hitomi's tablet. Breaking news, tensions rise in the Middle East. Iran suggests further drone attacks on U.S. bases in the UAE. The screen showed the devastation of downtown Dubai. Once a haven for the wealthy, the beautiful cityscape was now scarred by debris from intercepted missiles. Even with bases, they aren't protected. Hitomi recalled this secret agreement from last month's summit in Washington. The U.S. had prioritized Israel's defense, transferring the latest THAAD missile systems from Asia to the Middle East. In exchange, Japan was burdened with more base costs and demands for SDF deployment. The shields are gone, and all that's left are the magnets that attract attacks. A Chinese lease wouldn't make us a target for retaliation like a U.S. base does. And yet, in our peace-induced stupor, we haven't even built a single shelter. The fear of becoming a retaliation target was spreading near bases in Okinawa and Yokosuka. But in Japan, there was nowhere to hide. We entrusted our right to survive to the whims of America and sold our economic independence to the schemes of China. We play the part of Great Japan only inside YouTube, while in reality, we are being carved away piece by piece. Is this the end of the worst choice Japan ever made? She thought of Saicho Matsumoto's Painting on Black Ground, the story of a riot sparked by deserting soldiers from a U.S. base in Kakura. It depicted the distorted structure of an occupied nation and the hidden fuses of violence. Nothing has changed since then. Entrusting a nation's peace to a foreign power's convenience only ends with the citizens being pushed into the background of a painting on black ground. The price of looking away was now piling up like silent snow over a darkened Tokyo. The cold rain showed no sign of stopping. The infrastructure Japan once left behind supported people's lives. In contrast, all that remained in modern Japan were fuses no one would protect and timers no one could fix. Hitomi slowly closed the tablet and stared out at the city of Tokyo as it sank into the deep darkness. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Lease of Honey. 6 months later, Hitomi stood on the balcony of a luxury high-rise overlooking the Huangpu River in Shanghai. A tablet lay open on a table, displaying a grim email from her former colleagues in Kasumigaseki. Japan was still gasping under the weight of decaying infrastructure and the vanishing illusion of missile defense. Thinking about that country again? A voice came from behind. It was Wang, an executive at a major infrastructure conglomerate. Once her adversary at the ODA negotiation table, he was now her patron, keeping her in this gilded cage of luxury. Hitomi adjusted the collar of her silk robe and smiled coldly. I'm not reminiscing. I'm just confirming. Watching the place I abandoned fall apart exactly as scheduled. Hitomi had left Japan on a rainy day. She had smashed her tablet while a Japan is Great video was playing and contacted Wang. By me as your proprietary standard. My internal knowledge of the bureaucracy, the dregs of our technology, and above all, the scenario of how Japan will destroy itself. I will make all of it your asset. Wang had accepted instantly. To him, a former elite official like Hitomi was a strategic resource, more valuable than any rare earth metal. You are wise, Hitomi. If you had stayed, you would be living in fear next to a U.S. fuse, waiting for a timer you couldn't fix to go off. But here, the ports, the railways, everything is in our hands. The cities of this nation pulse with the goods you manage. Wang placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was colder than any lover's, the sensation of absolute possession. Hitomi looked out at the neon sprawl of Shanghai. This country, once filled with mouse suits and bicycles, had devoured Japan's generous technology and molted into a gargantuan monster. Now, the cutting-edge infrastructure was driven by programs written specifically to exclude the very people who had taught them how to fish. Tell me, Wang, do the people back there still believe that teaching someone how to fish is a virtue? Who knows? But since they've forgotten how to fish, it's our turn to give them fish. Of course, the fish comes with a collar of exorbitant interest and eternal service contracts. Hitomi leaned into Wang's chest. Once terrified by the painting on black ground, she was now the one painting it. She watched from the best seat in the house as Japan clung to its American shield while being swallowed by the Chinese stomach. Being a mistress was, in a sense, like a leased territory. You surrendered the sovereignty of your self-respect in exchange for an overwhelming guarantee of survival and the bounty of resources. I'm not foolish enough to go down with a country that's just waiting to be turned to ash. The lights of Shanghai reflected coldly in her eyes. On her tablet, titles like "Japan is Great" still flickered. She turned it off without a second glance. In the darkened screen, her own reflection appeared, emptier than the people on bicycles decades ago, yet clutching a far more certain life. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Price of Erosion. In a top-floor conference room of a Shanghai office building, a hypermodern nightscape pulsed like a network of fiber-optic veins. Hitomi sat beside Wang, flipping through documents for a takeover. The target was a mid-sized Japanese firm that handled the maintenance of Japan's aging power grid. Hitomi, your old friends are begging for help. They say they can't maintain the infrastructure on their own anymore due to the weak yen and rising costs. Wang sipped expensive white tea. Hitomi smiled coldly and operated her tablet. On the screen were the faces of her former colleagues, the elite bureaucrats who used to share "Japan is great" videos and drown in groundless confidence. Let's offer them our latest smart grid system at a discount. But there's one condition. The core OS must be our proprietary standard. And all maintenance rights for the next 99 years will be held by our subsidiaries. It was the ultimate thank you for the fishing lessons Japan had once provided. Hitomi, you're telling them that in exchange for giving them fish, power, they have to hand over the sea, energy sovereignty itself. Exactly. They'll jump at the cheap and high-performance Chinese tech. They're so desperate to avoid tomorrow's blackout that they'll ignore the collar being slipped around their necks. Or maybe they'll just pretend not to see it. Weeks later, Hitomi faced her former boss, a director general, via a video call. He looked haggard and desperate. Hitomi-san, these terms are too one-sided. If we accept this black box technology, our infrastructure falls into your hands forever. Hitomi replied in a quiet, dismissive voice. Director General, are you still dreaming? What can Japan protect now? You can't even stop a missile with your bases, and you rely on YouTube videos for your sanity. If you accept our proposal, at least the lights will stay on, and the logistics won't stop. Our railways and ports will deliver what your people need. Sovereignty is a vanity. Survival is a reality. You know which one matters more. Kasumigaseki fell silent. Hitomi felt a faint but certain pleasure in knowing she was now the one locking her generous homeland into a cage of proprietary standards. If you refuse, feel free to ask the US bases to provide your electricity. Oh, wait, aren't they too busy defending Israel to fix a single light bulb in Tokyo? The Director General's face twisted in despair. Hitomi cut the connection and turned to Wang. The lifelines of Japan's major cities are now de facto leased territories. Just like the Manchurian Railway or the North Korean power plants. Long after we are gone, only our standards will remain. Wang nodded with satisfaction and pulled her close. She had rewritten the fear of the painting on black ground into the pleasure of a red ground dominance. Hitomi, you are the finest proprietary standard this country has ever acquired. In her eyes, it was no longer raining in Tokyo. There was only the cold, predatory glint of a hunter who had stolen the fishing grounds and left her former comrades drowning in debt. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Current of Assassins. Hitomi's Erosion finally reached the sanctuary. A top-secret project to replace all communication infrastructure in Japan's major ports with Chinese proprietary standards. Once complete, the heart of Japan's supply chain would fall entirely into Chinese hands. Meanwhile, in a corner of Kasumigaseki, a man sensed the movement. It was Nomura, an official at the Cabinet Intelligence and Research Office, Hitomi's former colleague and ex-lover. Nomura had obtained the secret memo Hitomi had sent to Wang, detailing the vulnerabilities of the system. Hitomi, you've gone this far? Nomura remembered the days he shared with her, the self-deprecating but certain sense of crisis. Now, she had turned that crisis into a weapon to devour her own motherland. He looked at his colleagues watching Japan is Great videos and sighed. This country will die while watching YouTube. But you, I must be the one to stop you. Nomura contacted an international assassination ring. Target, Hitomi Maruki, aide to Wang in Shanghai. Any means necessary. Erase her from this current. Days later, in Wang's office in Shanghai, Hitomi opened an envelope with no return address. Inside was an old photograph. It was Beijing decades ago, filled with mouse suits and bicycles. Younger versions of the Director General and Japanese engineers were smiling in front of a newly built ODA plant. On the back was a note in Nomura's handwriting. We won't teach you how to fish. We won't give you fish. We will simply rewrite the current. Hitomi stared at the photo. Nomura's intent was clear. Just as she was eroding Japan's infrastructure, Nomura was attempting to rewrite her very existence. The current, yes. I am just writing it. Wang, I'm going out for some air. She left Wang's desk and stepped onto the balcony. In the nightscape, the phantom of the generous Japan she once loathed flickered, a faint but certain omen of death. Nomura, are you coming to stop my timer? Hitomi looked down at the Huangpu River. The cold water no longer reflected the illusions of a great Japan. There was only the relentless current of survival of the fittest, rising to swallow her whole. End of Chapter 4. Epilogue. Echoes of the current. The night wind at the Bund was colder than the November rain in Tokyo, stinging Hitomi's cheeks. The Huangpu River below flowed with a murky, muddy hue. The people Japan once taught to fish were now operating gargantuan dredgers, rewriting the fishing grounds of the entire world. She had cast herself into that very torrent. Inside the room behind her, Wang was on the phone, ecstatic. The final phase, the switch of Japan's port communications to Chinese standards, had been approved. Japan's throat was now firmly in China's grasp. Hitomi gripped Nomura's letter in her pocket. Rewrite the current. The words throbbed in time with her heartbeat. An assassin might be lurking in this very building. Or perhaps Nomura had planted a reverse timer within the Chinese systems she herself had arranged. Hitomi, what's wrong? Let's toast. Your homeland is now officially our living artery. Wang approached with 2 glasses. His smile was the polar opposite of the Japan-drunk old men she despised, the smile of a cold, absolute victor. Hitomi turned to him and offered a soft smile. Her eyes, once dead like a fish in Kasumigaseki, were now vibrant, yet profoundly lonely. Yes, let's. After all, there's no home left to go back to. She took the glass and looked up at the night sky. The geometric patterns of U.S. satellites, fuses, and Chinese infrastructure's dominance wove an invisible web across the heavens. At that moment, Hitomi's smartphone's screen lit up silently. Caller, unknown. But the coordinates displayed pointed precisely to the spot where she stood. Had Nomura moved? Or was the other current she herself had set in motion starting to flow? Hitomi brought the glass to her lips. Beyond the amber liquid, the neon lights of Shanghai flashed violently in red, like fresh blood spilled over a painting on black ground. Let's see then, whose current will remain at the end. As she took a sip, a faint vibration traveled through the concrete beneath her feet. Was it the final death rattle of a nation called Japan, or the beginning of her own end? In the darkness of the night, there was no one left to answer. The end.